In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a priceless 17th century painting, The Golden Harvest, vanishes from the meadow gallery, leaving only an empty frame and a whisper of scandal. Was it the fastidious curator, hiding a lapse in his perfect security? The bohemian artist, with her secret canvas and black market ties? The flamboyant collector, whose passion masked deeper motives? Or a shadowy thief known as the Magpie? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet knitting, can unravel the threads of greed and deception. A single ochre smudge leads her to a daring forgery, a frightened boy, and a web of lies, proving that, in St. Mary Mead, no secret stays hidden for long. Chapter 1. The Empty Frame. The late summer sun cast a warm glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden light filtering through the elms that lined the village square. The annual art exhibition at the Meadow Gallery, a modest but cherished institution, had drawn a larger crowd than usual, for word had spread of a rare treasure. The Golden Harvest, a 17th century painting by a Dutch master, whose name, though obscure, carried weight among collectors. Its canvas, alive with shimmering wheat fields and a luminous sky, seemed to hold the very essence of a forgotten era. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a cushioned bench by the gallery's tall window, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her eyes, sharp despite the gentle lines of age, flitted from face to face, noting the subtle currents beneath the polite chatter. The gallery, a converted Georgian manor, hummed with the low murmur of voices and the clink of teacups. Visitors milled about, their footsteps echoing on the polished oak floor. At the centre of the room, the Golden Harvest hung in solitary splendour, its gilt frame catching the light. Mr. Clarence Winthrop, the curator, hovered nearby, his thin fingers adjusting the velvet rope that separated the painting from the crowd. A man of meticulous habits, his grey suit was as immaculate as the gallery itself, though Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in his hands as he smoothed his tie. A nervous sort, she thought, her needles clicking softly, but then such a responsibility would weigh on anyone. Across the room, Miss Lydia Crane, an artist of local repute, stood with a glass of sherry, her bohemian scarf trailing over a paint-stained smock. She spoke animatedly to a small knot of admirers, her voice carrying a note of pride as she described her role in restoring the Golden Harvest some years ago. Her dark eyes darted toward the painting now and then, though Miss Marple wondered if it was admiration or something else that drew her gaze. "She's not quite at ease," Miss Marple mused, her mind drifting to a young woman in the village years ago, who had worn the same guarded look when hiding a secret. "Near the refreshment table, mister. Reginald Hawthorne, a collector whose wealth was as conspicuous as his crimson waistcoat, held court with booming enthusiasm. His broad face flushed with excitement as he recounted his pursuit of rare artworks across the continent. "This painting," he declared to a bemused couple, "is a masterpiece, worth every penny of its £50,000. Miss Marple's lips twitched slightly. His fervour was genuine, but there was a performative quality to it, as if he wished to ensure everyone knew of his intentions to acquire the piece. "He likes to be noticed," she thought, her needles pausing briefly. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, a stout, cheerful woman and an old friend of Miss Marple's, bustled over, her cheeks pink from the warmth of the room. "Jane, isn't it splendid?" she said, gesturing toward the painting. "Such a pity it's to be sold off to some private collector like Mr. Hawthorne. It belongs in a museum, don't you think?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes still scanning the crowd. "It's a lovely thing," she replied, "but beauty often attracts trouble, Dolly." Mrs. Bantry laughed, assuming her friend was being whimsical, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the painting, her mind alert to the undercurrents in the room. As the afternoon waned, the crowd began to thin, and Mr. Winthrop announced the gallery would close shortly. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, joined Mrs. Bantry for a final turn about the room. They paused before the golden harvest, its colours seeming to deepen in the fading light. "It's almost alive," Mrs. Bantry murmured. Miss Marple nodded, her attention caught by a faint irregularity, a smudge of ochre paint on the floor, just beneath the frame. She bent slightly, her eyes narrowing, but before she could comment, a piercing cry shattered the quiet. "It's gone!" Mr. Winthrop's voice, usually so measured, rang with disbelief. The crowd turned as one, and a collective gasp rose. The ornate frame, moments ago a proud showcase, now hung empty, its canvas vanished without a trace. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, how could this happen?" she whispered. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unyielding, swept the room, noting Mr. Winthrop's pallor, Miss Crane's sudden stillness, and Mr. Hawthorne's thunderous expression. "How indeed?" she said softly, her mind already turning over the puzzle. "People are so careless with their secrets," she thought, "and yet so clever at hiding them." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The Meadow Gallery, bathed in the soft glow of its crystal chandeliers, had transformed from a place of cultured admiration to a stage of chaos in mere moments. The empty frame of the golden harvest, stark against the rich burgundy wall, seemed to mock the gathered crowd, its gilt edges glinting accusingly. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly to one side, her small figure almost lost among the taller forms of the villagers, who whispered and craned their necks to glimpse the void where the painting had hung. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, forgotten for the moment, as her keen eyes took in every detail of the scene. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her face flushed with a mixture of shock and indignation, hovered beside her, murmuring about the scandal of it all. "Jane, it's unthinkable," she said, her voice trembling. "A painting like that, gone in broad daylight." Miss Marple's lips formed a faint, thoughtful line. "Not quite daylight, Dolly," she replied softly, her gaze fixed on the empty frame. "It was nearly closing time, and the light was fading." People's attention wanders at such moments. Her words were gentle, but her mind was already sifting through the fragments of the evening, piecing together the subtle discord she had sensed among the gallery's guests. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his brisk stride and purposeful air cutting through the nervous chatter. A young man for an inspector, with a lean face and sharp eyes, he had earned Miss Marple's respect in past encounters for his diligence, if not always for his imagination. He carried a small notebook, its pages already filling with neat, precise notes, and his dark overcoat was slightly damp from the evening mist that had settled over St. Mary Mead. He nodded politely to Miss Marple, who had been summoned to the gallery at Mrs. Bantry's insistence, her position on the gallery committee lending weight to her request. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, his tone formal but warm, Mrs. Bantry tells me you were here when the theft was discovered. I'd value your observations if you'd care to share them." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes twinkling faintly. "I'm only an old woman, Inspector, with a habit of noticing things. But I'll tell you what I saw, if it's of any use." She gestured toward the empty frame, her voice calm. The painting was there not half an hour before Mr. Winthrop's cry. The gallery was still open, but the crowd was thinning. People were distracted. Teacups, goodbyes, the usual end-of-event bustle. A clever moment for a thief, don't you think? Craddock's brow furrowed as he jotted down her words. "Clever indeed," he said, turning to survey the room. The gallery was a grand space, its high ceilings and tall windows giving it an air of faded elegance. The walls were lined with other artworks, landscapes, portraits, and still lifes, but none drew the eye as the Golden Harvest had. The empty frame, now cordoned off by a velvet rope, was the focal point of every gaze. Craddock stepped closer, examining the wall and floor with care. "No signs of forced entry," he muttered, almost to himself. "The windows are locked, the doors secure." No alarms triggered. It's as if the painting simply vanished. Miss Marple followed his gaze, her attention lingering on the faint smudge of ochre paint she had noticed earlier, barely visible on the polished oak floor beneath the frame. She said nothing, but her mind turned over the detail, filing it away like a piece of her knitting pattern. "Have you spoken to Mr. Winthrop yet, Inspector?" she asked, her tone mild. "He's waiting in his office," Craddock replied. "He's shaken, naturally. Says the gallery's security is foolproof. I'll need to verify that, of course." He glanced at her, a hint of curiosity in his expression. "You suspect something already, don't you, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly, adjusting her shawl. "I suspect only that people are rarely as careful as they think, Inspector. And a painting doesn't vanish without someone's help." Craddock nodded, accustomed to her cryptic remarks, and turned to address the small group of gallery staff who had been detained. There was Tom Riley, the young cleaner, his freckled face pale, and his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Mrs. Ellis, the part-time clerk, a stout woman with a perpetually harried air. And Mr. Gibbs, the security guard, whose broad shoulders and stern demeanour seemed at odds with the theft's undetected execution. Each swore they had seen nothing unusual, though Tom's stammer grew more pronounced under Craddock's questioning. And Mrs. Ellis kept glancing toward the door, as if wishing to escape. Miss Marple, standing near the refreshment table, listened as Craddock methodically questioned the staff. Her eyes drifted to the table itself, where a few half-empty teacups and plates of biscuits remained. A napkin, crumpled and slightly stained with what looked like a smear of paint, caught her attention. She bent to examine it, careful not to touch it, and noted its colour, a deep, rich ochre, not unlike the smudge on the floor. "Curious," she murmured, straightening up as Mrs. Bantry approached. "Jane, you're seeing things again, aren't you?" Mrs. Bantry said, her voice a mix of amusement and awe. "What is it this time? A napkin? Surely that can't mean anything." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Everything means something, Dolly, if you know where to look. A napkin, a smudge, a nervous glance. They're all stitches in the same fabric." She turned her attention back to the room, where Mr. Clarence Winthrop had emerged from his office, his face ashen and his cufflinks glinting as he adjusted them nervously. "Inspector," Winthrop said, his voice tight, "this is a disaster. The Golden Harvest was the centerpiece of our exhibition. Its loss, it's unthinkable. The gallery's reputation, my reputation." He broke off, running a hand through his thinning hair. Craddock's tone was measured. "Mr. Winthrop, walk me through the evening. When did you last see the painting intact?" Winthrop hesitated, his eyes darting to the empty frame. "At 5:30, perhaps 5:45. I checked it myself before making my rounds to lock up. The alarms were set, the windows secured. I left through the back door at 6 as always, and my assistant, Mr. Gibbs, can confirm." Mr. Gibbs nodded gruffly, his arms crossed. "Locked up tight, sir." "I checked the doors myself after Mr." Winthrop left. No one got in or out. Miss Marple, listening quietly, noted the curator's emphasis on the alarms. And yet, she thought, something slipped through. She glanced at Miss Lydia Crane, who stood apart from the group, her bohemian scarf now draped loosely over her shoulders. The artist's face was composed, but her fingers toyed with a paintbrush she had pulled from her pocket, a restless gesture that did not escape Miss Marple's notice. "Miss Crane," Craddock called, turning to her. "You were here all evening, I understand. You restored the painting some years ago, correct?" Miss Crane nodded, her voice cool. "I did. It was delicate work, restoring the glazes, preserving the original pigments. I spent months on it." Her eyes flicked to the empty frame, and for a moment a shadow crossed her face. "It's a terrible loss," she added, but her tone lacked the fervour of Winthrop's distress. "Where were you when the painting was discovered missing?" Craddock pressed. "In the ante-room, sketching," she replied. "I like to capture the mood of these events." I didn't notice anything unusual until Mr. Winthrop shouted Miss Marple's needles, which she had retrieved from her bag, clicked softly as she listened. Sketching, she thought, a convenient excuse to linger. She recalled Miss Crane's earlier detachment, the way her eyes had lingered on the painting with an intensity that seemed more proprietary than admiring. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, meanwhile, had not been idle. His booming voice carried across the room as he demanded answers, his crimson waistcoat straining against his broad chest. "This is an outrage," he declared, striding toward Craddock. "I was prepared to pay a fortune for that painting. Someone must be held accountable." Craddock raised a hand, his patience thinning. "Mr. Hawthorne, where were you at 6 o'clock?" "In the refreshment room, enjoying a glass of claret," Hawthorne said, his tone indignant. "Ask anyone. Mrs. Bantry herself saw me there." Mrs. Bantry nodded reluctantly. "He was there for a time, Inspector, but I couldn't say for the entire evening." People were coming and going. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Hawthorne's bluster was convincing, but his insistence on his whereabouts felt rehearsed. She thought of a neighbour in St. Mary Mead, a man who had once protested his innocence with similar vigour, only to be found hiding stolen silver in his garden shed. Loud voices often cover quiet truths, she mused. Craddock, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the gallery's security system. The alarms, he confirmed, were state-of-the-art, designed to trigger at the slightest disturbance. Yet they had remained silent. The windows, tall and narrow, were locked from the inside, their latches undisturbed. The front and back doors showed no signs of tampering. "It's as if the painting walked out on its own," Craddock said, frustration creeping into his voice. Miss Marple stepped closer to the empty frame. her small figure dwarfed by its grandeur. She bent slightly, her eyes fixed on the ochre smudge on the floor. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but its presence was undeniable. She glanced at the napkin on the refreshment table, then back at the smudge. "Inspector," she said quietly, "have you noticed this mark on the floor?" "It's paint, I believe. Ochre, like the pigments in the Golden Harvest." Craddock crouched beside her, his flashlight illuminating the smudge. "You're right," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "It's fresh, too. Could be a clue, though it's hard to say how it got here." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "But it's curious, don't you think, that a painting should vanish without a trace, yet leave behind a speck of itself?" Her mind turned to the village grocer's boy, who had once left a trail of flour from a pilfered sack, leading straight to his hiding place. Small things, she thought, so often betray the larger ones. Craddock ordered the smudge to be photographed and sampled, then turned to the staff. "No one leaves until we've searched the premises," he said firmly, "and I'll need statements from everyone present." He glanced at Miss Marple, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You'll stay, I hope, Miss Marple. Your knack for seeing what others miss is, well, remarkable." Miss Marple returned his smile, her eyes bright. "I'll stay, Inspector, if only to see how the pieces fit. People are so careless, you know, even when they think they've planned everything perfectly." As the police began their search, Miss Marple settled onto a bench. Her knitting resumed. The gallery, now a crime scene, buzzed with activity, but her mind was quiet. Turning over the details, Winthrop's nervous cufflinks, Crane's restless paintbrush, Hawthorne's loud alibi, and the ochre smudge that seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be uncovered. She thought of a girl in the village long ago who had stolen a ribbon and left a thread caught on a fence. "It's always the little things," she murmured, her needles clicking steadily, "that unravel the whole." The search yielded nothing. No hidden canvas, no tools, no signs of a break-in. The painting, it seemed, had indeed vanished into the evening mist. But Miss Marple, watching the suspects as they gave their statements, felt a quiet certainty. Someone in this room knew more than they were saying. And she, with her unassuming air and her knack for seeing the patterns in human nature, would find them out. Chapter 3. The Curator's Tale. The Meadow Gallery, though still grand in its bones, felt diminished under the weight of the evening's calamity. The chandeliers cast a softer light now, as if reluctant to expose the full measure of the theft's audacity. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner of the curator's office, a small book-lined room at the rear of the gallery, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her attention. Inspector Craddock stood by the desk, his notebook open, while Mr. Clarence Winthrop, the curator, sat opposite, his thin frame hunched as if bearing a physical burden. Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on accompanying Miss Marple, stood near the door, her eyes wide with curiosity, though she kept uncharacteristically silent. The office was a study in order. Shelves of catalogued art books, a neatly arranged desk with a single fountain pen and a leather blotter, and a small window overlooking the gallery's walled garden, now shrouded in evening mist. Mr. Winthrop's cufflinks gleamed as he clasped and unclasped his hands. A nervous tic Miss Marple had noted earlier. His grey suit, though immaculate, seemed to hang on him now. as if the theft had stripped him of some vital vigour. "Mr. Winthrop," Craddock began, his tone firm but not unkind, "let's go over it again. You last saw the painting at 5:30, you said?" Winthrop nodded, his voice low. "Yes, Inspector. I made my rounds before closing, as I always do. The golden harvest was in its place, secure in its frame. I adjusted the rope myself. There were still a few visitors lingering, you see, and I wanted to ensure no one got too close." He paused, his fingers straying to his cufflinks again. "I can't fathom how this happened. The alarms, the locks, they're all state-of-the-art. I've overseen this gallery for 15 years, and never once." Craddock raised a hand. "I understand, sir. But let's stick to the facts. You left at 6, through the back door, with Mr. Gibbs confirming, correct?" "Yes," Winthrop said, his eyes flickering to the window. "Gibbs locked up behind me. I went straight home. My cottage is just across the square. My housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, can vouch for my arrival by 6:15. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second as she listened. She thought of Mr. Phipps, a retired schoolmaster in St. Mary Mead, who had once been so precise about his routines that no one suspected he'd slipped out to poach trout from the vicar's stream. Precision, she mused, can be a mask as much as a virtue. She glanced at Winthrop, noting the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, despite the coolness of the room. Craddock flipped a page in his notebook. "The painting's value, £50,000, you said. That's a significant sum. Had there been any unusual interest in it? Offers? Inquiries? Anything out of the ordinary?" Winthrop hesitated, his fingers stilling on his cufflinks. "Well, Mr. Hawthorne, of course. He made no secret of his desire to buy it. He approached me weeks ago, offering a substantial sum, that we hadn't finalized anything. And there were rumors, you know, about that thief, the one they call the Magpie. I read about him in the papers, targeting antiques and paintings, but I never thought—" His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "I took every precaution." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, flicked up from her knitting. "And the painting's history, Mr. Winthrop?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "It's a rare piece, I understand. Had it been in the gallery long?" Winthrop turned to her, a touch of surprise in his expression, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. It's been in our collection for decades, though it was only recently authenticated as a work by Peter van der Meer, a minor Dutch master. Miss Crane, Lydia, did the restoration work some years ago, which brought its value to light. We'd planned to display it prominently this season before." He gestured vaguely, his distress evident. "Before Mr. Hawthorne's offer," Miss Marple finished, her tone mild. "And this authentication, did it attract much attention?" Winthrop nodded. "A few scholars, some collectors. The usual sort, but nothing untoward, I assure you." His voice held a note of defensiveness, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind filing away his words. She thought of a village widow who had once been overly protective of her late husband's medals, only to be found selling them to a dealer in secret. Craddock, meanwhile, was examining a diagram of the gallery's layout, provided by Winthrop. "The alarms," he said, tapping the paper. "They cover the frame itself, correct? Any attempt to remove the painting should have triggered them." "Precisely," Winthrop said, his voice regaining some firmness. The system is wired to detect vibrations or tampering. It's checked weekly. Last checked 2 days ago, in fact. Everything was in order. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. And yet, she thought, the painting is gone, and the alarms are silent. She recalled a young lad in the village, caught stealing eggs because he'd forgotten to wipe the yolk from his hands. Carelessness, she mused, or perhaps something more deliberate. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "Thank you, Mr. Winthrop. I'll need to speak with your staff again, and I'd like to see the alarm system's logs. If you'll excuse us, I'll have my men continue the search." Winthrop rose, his movements stiff. "Of course, Inspector. Anything you need, I just want the painting found." He glanced at Miss Marple, as if seeking reassurance, but her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the cufflinks that glinted as he adjusted his sleeves yet again. As Winthrop left the office, Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Jane, he's awfully rattled, isn't he? Do you think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "People are often rattled when their world is disrupted, Dolly. But Mr. Winthrop's distress seems particular. He's a man who likes control, and this theft has taken that from him. Or perhaps," she added, her voice dropping, "he's lost more than he's telling us." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You don't think he took it himself, do you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think only that people are rarely as simple as they seem. Now, let's see what the inspector uncovers outside." The gallery was quiet. The crowd dispersed save for the few staff members and suspects detained for questioning. Craddock's men were combing the premises, their flashlights sweeping over corners and alcoves. Miss Marple, escorted by Mrs. Bantry, returned to the main hall, where the empty frames still dominated the room. She paused before it, her gaze lingering on the ochre smudge she had pointed out to Craddock. The police had marked it now, a small chalk circle preserving it for analysis, but Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere, turning over Winthrop's words, his nervous gestures, and the curious silence of the alarms. She thought of Miss Crane, whose restoration work had brought the golden harvest to prominence, and Mr. Hawthorne, whose loud desire for the painting had drawn every eye. And then there was the shadow of the magpie, the thief whose name hung over the village like a spectre. Someone, she murmured, knew exactly what they were doing. Her eyes flicked to the refreshment table, where the napkin with its ochre stain had been collected as evidence. She wondered who had held it and why. Craddock approached, his expression grim. "Miss Marple, the alarm logs are clean, no disruptions, no malfunctions, and the search hasn't turned up a single clue beyond that smudge you found." It's as if the painting dissolved into thin air. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Nothing dissolves, Inspector. It's only hidden, waiting for the right eyes to find it. Have you considered the staff? Young Tom Riley, for instance. He seemed terribly nervous." Craddock nodded. "I noticed. He's next on my list. But I'll need more than nerves to pin this down. Whoever did this was clever. Too clever for a spur-of-the-moment job." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Cleverness is a dangerous thing, Inspector. It makes people think they're untouchable. But there's always a thread left dangling, if you know where to look." As Craddock moved off to question Tom Riley, Miss Marple settled onto a bench, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The gallery felt colder now, the absence of the golden harvest like a wound in the room's heart. She thought of Winthrop's cufflinks, his insistence on the alarms, and the faint tremor in his hands. She thought, too, of a village spinster who had once hidden a stolen brooch in her sewing basket, believing no one would look there. People, she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, are so predictable in their unpredictability. Mrs. Bantry chuckled, though her eyes were still wide with excitement. Jane, you're impossible. I swear you see more sitting there with your knitting than Craddock does with all his policemen. Miss Marple's smile was serene. I only see what's there, Dolly. And what's there is always enough if you pay attention. Chapter 4. The Artist's Motive. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Lydia Crane's cottage, casting delicate shadows on the cluttered studio within. The air was thick with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil, a sharp contrast to the polished elegance of the Meadow Gallery. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a worn velvet chair, her knitting bag at her side, surveyed the room with quiet interest. Canvases leaned against every wall, some half-finished, others vibrant with colour, while brushes and palettes lay scattered across a paint-splattered table. Miss Crane, her bohemian scarf now replaced by a smock streaked with blues and yellows, stood by an easel, her movements brisk as she prepared tea for her guests. Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on accompanying Miss Marple, perched on a stool, her curiosity barely contained. Such a charming studio, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, but her eyes sharp as they took in the chaos. You must find great inspiration here, Miss Crane. Lydia Crane glanced up, her dark eyes wary. It's my sanctuary, she replied, pouring tea into mismatched cups. A place to create, to think, though I suppose it's a bit untidy for visitors. She offered a tight smile, setting the teapot down with a clatter. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, leaned forward. Oh, but it's so artistic. All these paintings. Do you work on them all at once? Her eyes darted to a canvas in the corner, half covered by a cloth, its colours peeking out in familiar golds and ochres. Miss Crane's smile faltered. Some are studies, others experiments. I don't always finish what I start. She handed Miss Marple a cup, her fingers brushing the handle with a slight tremor. Miss Marple noted it, her mind drifting to a young seamstress in St. Mary Mead, who had trembled in just such a way when questioned about a missing bolt of silk. Inspector Craddock had suggested Miss Marple visit Miss Crane, knowing her knack for drawing out truths in casual conversation. The artist, he'd noted, had been evasive during his initial questioning at the gallery, her alibi of sketching in the anteroom unconfirmed by any witness. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the artist's restless energy, the way her gaze flickered toward the covered canvas whenever Mrs. Bantry's attention strayed. You restored the golden harvest, I understand, Miss Marple said, her tone light. It must have been a remarkable experience, working so closely with such a rare piece. Miss Crane nodded, her expression softening. It was extraordinary. The pigments, the brushwork. Vandermeer had a way of capturing light that's almost impossible to replicate. I spent months studying it, layer by layer, to preserve its essence. Her voice held a note of reverence, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting hardness in her eyes, as if the memory carried more than pride. Months, Miss Marple mused, her needles clicking softly from the bag she'd opened. You must have known the painting better than anyone. Every stroke, every shade, that's a rare intimacy, don't you think? Miss Crane's hand paused on her teacup. I suppose it is, she said, her voice measured. But restoration is about fidelity, not possession. I gave it back to the world when I was done. She stood abruptly, moving to adjust a canvas on the easel, though it needed no adjustment. Mrs. Bantry, oblivious to the tension, gestured toward the covered canvas. Is that one of your studies? It looks rather like the Golden Harvest. Those colours, I mean. May we see it? Miss Crane's face tightened, but she recovered quickly, pulling the cloth aside with a practised ease. The canvas revealed a partial reproduction of the Golden Harvest, its wheat fields glowing in the morning light, though the sky was unfinished, a patchwork of blues and greys. Just a study, she said, her tone clipped. I often revisit old works to refine my technique. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the canvas, noting the freshness of the paint, its sheen suggesting it had been applied recently, far more recently than a years-old restoration would warrant. It's beautifully done, she said, her voice warm, almost as if you'd painted it yesterday. She smiled, but her words hung in the air, and Miss Crane's fingers tightened on the cloth. Mrs. Bantry, sensing nothing amiss, chattered on. You must be heartbroken about the theft, Lydia. To lose something you worked so hard to restore. Do you think that awful magpie fellow took it? Miss Crane's lips twitched, a fleeting expression that might have been amusement or disdain. The magpie? Perhaps. He's clever, they say, but I doubt he'd bother with a small gallery like ours. It's more likely someone local, someone who knew the painting's value. She glanced at Miss Marple, as if gauging her reaction, then turned to pour more tea. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Someone local, she repeated softly. That's an interesting thought. It would take knowledge, wouldn't it? Knowledge of the gallery, the alarms, the painting itself. She paused, her eyes meeting Miss Crane's. You'd know better than most, I imagine, having worked on it so closely. Miss Crane's smile was brittle. I know paint and canvas, Miss Marple, not alarms or locks. I was sketching when it happened, as I told the inspector. I didn't see anything. Her voice was firm, but her fingers toyed with the paintbrush in her pocket, a restless gesture that reminded Miss Marple of a village girl who'd fidgeted with her apron when caught fibbing about a broken vase. Mrs. Bantry, eager to contribute, leaned forward. But you were in the ante-room, weren't you? Couldn't you have seen someone passing by? The gallery wasn't that crowded by then. Miss Crane's eyes narrowed slightly. The ante-room's off to the side, Mrs. Bantry. I was focused on my sketch. I didn't notice anyone coming or going. She set her cup down with a clink, her movements sharp. If you'll excuse me, I have work to finish. This theft has put me behind on my commissions. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. Of course, my dear, we won't keep you. It's only that I find it so fascinating how someone could take such a painting without a trace. It's almost as if they knew it as well as you do. Her smile was kind, but her eyes held a quiet intensity that made Miss Crane pause. As they left the cottage, Mrs. Bantry linked arms with Miss Marple, her voice bubbling with excitement. Jane, did you see how jumpy she was? And that canvas, it looked so much like the stolen one. Do you think she's involved? Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "I think, Dolly, that Miss Crane knows more about the golden harvest than she's letting on. Whether that makes her a thief or merely a witness, I can't say yet, but that canvas—" She trailed off, her mind turning over the fresh paint, the artist's guarded demeanour, and the ochre smudge from the gallery floor. She thought of a painter's apprentice in St. Mary Mead, who had once copied a neighbour's watercolour to sell at a fair, believing no one would notice the difference. Skill, she murmured, can be a dangerous thing when it's used to deceive. They walked back toward the village square, the morning air crisp and the elms rustling softly. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently at her side, but her thoughts were far from the wool and needles within. She considered Miss Crane's financial struggles, rumoured in the village though never confirmed, and the way her eyes had lingered on the canvas, as if guarding a secret. "People," she said softly, almost to herself, "are so careless with their truths, even when they think they've hidden them well." Mrs. Bantry glanced at her, puzzled. "Jane, you're doing it again, seeing things I don't." "What are you thinking?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I'm thinking, Dolly, that a painting doesn't vanish without leaving a trace, and Miss Crane's traces are rather colourful, don't you think?" Chapter 5. The buyer's bluster. The village square of St. Mary Mead sparkled under a midday sun, its cobblestones warm and the air scented with late summer roses. Miss Jane Marple walked arm in arm with Mrs. Bantry, her steps measured but purposeful, as they approached the Red Lion Inn, where Mr. Reginald Hawthorne had agreed to meet them. The inn, with its ivy-clad walls and low-beamed ceilings, was a favourite haunt for visitors, and Mr. Hawthorne, a man who relished attention, seemed to have made it his temporary court. Miss Marple's knitting bag hung lightly from her elbow, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the bustling square for any hint of the undercurrents that had swirled since the golden harvest vanished from the meadow gallery. Mrs. Bantry, her hat slightly askew from their brisk walk, was brimming with anticipation. "Jane, do you think Mr. Hawthorne could be involved? He was so loud about wanting that painting, almost too loud, if you ask me." Her voice carried a note of glee, as if the prospect of unmasking a culprit thrilled her. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "People who shout their intentions, Dolly, often do so to drown out their doubts, or someone else's suspicions, but we shall see." She thought of a village auction years ago, where a loud-mouthed farmer had bid extravagantly on a horse to distract from his pilfered apples hidden in the barn. "Bluster," she mused, "is a poor disguise for cleverness." Inside the Red Lion, the air was cool and dim, smelling of polished wood and ale. Mr. Hawthorne sat at a corner table, his crimson waistcoat straining against his broad chest as he gestured expansively to a small audience of locals. His voice boomed, recounting a tale of acquiring a Renaissance sketch in Florence, and his ruddy face glowed with self-satisfaction. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached, he rose with a flourish, his chair scraping against the floor. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry!" he exclaimed, his tone hearty. "What a pleasure! Come, sit, let me order you some tea, or perhaps something stronger." His laugh was loud, but Miss Marple noted a flicker of wariness in his eyes, quickly masked by his geniality. "Tea will do nicely, Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her usual grace. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, and she adjusted her shawl, her eyes never leaving the collector's face. "We won't keep you long. I understand you were quite taken with the golden harvest. Such a pity about its loss." Hawthorne's expression darkened, his jowls quivering with indignation. "A pity? It's a travesty, Miss Marple. That painting was a masterpiece, a jewel of Dutch art. I'd offered £50,000, more than fair, mind you, and was ready to sign the papers. To think some scoundrel snatched it from under our noses." He slammed a fist on the table, making the teacups rattle. Mrs. Bantry, undeterred by his theatrics, leaned forward. "But where were you when it happened, Mr. Hawthorne? You were in the refreshment room, you said, but no one seems quite sure of the time." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed, though his smile remained. "I was there, Mrs. Bantry, enjoying a glass of claret and some excellent company. Half the village saw me. Mrs. Ellis, that clerk, even passed by with a tray. I didn't set foot near the painting after 5 o'clock. His tone was firm, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers drumming on the table, a restless rhythm that belied his confidence. She sipped her tea, her gaze soft but piercing. "You know a great deal about art, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice mild. "You spoke so vividly of the golden harvest, its brushwork, its colours, almost as if you'd studied it closely, perhaps more closely than a buyer might." Hawthorne blinked, his bluster faltering for a moment. "Well, naturally, I studied it." "A collector must know what he's buying, Miss Marple." "I examined it during the exhibition, asked Winthrop about its provenance. All perfectly above board." He leaned back, folding his arms, but his posture was stiff, as if bracing for further scrutiny. Miss Marple's needles, now retrieved from her bag, clicked softly. "Of course," she said, her tone soothing. "It's only that such knowledge is rare. You must have spent time with it, perhaps even before the exhibition opened." Her question hung in the air, innocent but pointed, and she watched as Hawthorne's fingers paused their drumming. "I may have seen it during a private viewing," he admitted, his voice grudging. "Winthrop allowed me a closer look a few days prior. Standard practice for serious buyers." He waved a hand dismissively, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, a telltale sign she'd seen in a village shopkeeper who'd once overstated his stock to inflate a sale. Mrs. Bantry, sensing an opening, pressed further. "But you were so keen on it, Mr. Hawthorne. Did you ever think someone else might want it too? That magpie thief, perhaps? Or someone closer to home?" Hawthorne's laugh was a bark. "The magpie! Poppycock! That's a story for the papers. If you ask me, it's someone in this village, someone who knew the gallery's workings. Winthrop's too fussy to miss a trick, and yet here we are." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "I'd wager on that artist, Miss Crane. She's got the skill to pull it off, and I heard she's strapped for cash." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "An interesting theory," she said, "but skill alone doesn't make a thief. It takes opportunity and nerve. You were in the refreshment room, you say. Did you notice anyone else lingering near the painting? Miss Crane, perhaps? Or young Tom Riley?" Hawthorne frowned, his brow furrowing as if the question required effort. "Can't say I did. I was busy with my claret and conversation. That boy Tom was about, clearing cups, but I didn't see him near the painting. As for Miss Crane, she was off in her own world, sketching or some such." He shrugged, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the side, as if sifting through his own memory for flaws. Thought of a saint, Mary Mead Grocer, who'd once claimed to be too busy to notice a stolen loaf, only to be caught with crumbs on his coat. People, she mused, are so quick to point fingers, yet so slow to see their own shadows. She set her teacup down, her movements deliberate. You travel often, mister. Hawthorne, don't you? For your collections, I mean. Europe, perhaps. Hawthorne's chest puffed out, his pride resurfacing. Oh, yes. Paris, Florence, Amsterdam. I've hunted treasures across the continent. Art's my passion, Miss Marple, and I've a nose for a bargain. He chuckled, but the sound was forced, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over his words. Amsterdam, she repeated softly. The home of the Golden Harvest's artist, I believe. You must have contacts there. Dealers, perhaps, who know the value of such a piece. Her tone was conversational, but her eyes held his, searching for the flicker of unease she expected. Hawthorne cleared his throat, his fingers resuming their drumming. A few, yes, but I'm no smuggler, if that's what you're implying. I buy legally, through proper channels. His voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables, and he lowered it quickly. Look, I wanted that painting, but I didn't steal it. I'm the victim here, out £50,000 and a masterpiece. Miss Marple nodded, her smile unchanged. Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. It's only that a collector's passion can sometimes blind them to other possibilities. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for your time. I'm sure Inspector Craddock will be in touch. As they left the inn, Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Jane, he's hiding something, isn't he? All that bluster, and yet he couldn't quite look you in the eye. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as they stepped into the sunlight. He's a man who likes to be seen, Dolly, but not too closely. His knowledge of the painting is curious, too detailed perhaps for a mere buyer, and his travels, they raise questions. She thought of a village widower who'd boasted of his travels to cover secret meetings with a bookie. Passion, she murmured, can be a motive as much as a mask. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You think he's the magpie, don't you? Or working with him? Miss Marple's smile was serene. I think only that, mister. Hawthorne knows more than he's saying, Dolly, and what he knows may be the key to finding our painting. Now, shall we see what Inspector Craddock has learned? Her needles clicked softly as they walked, her mind weaving together the threads of Hawthorne's bluster, Miss Crane's canvas, and the ochre smudge that lingered like a whisper of the truth. Chapter 6. Whispers of a Thief. The afternoon light in St. Mary Mead carried a deceptive calm, as if the village's tidy cottages and blooming hedgerows could deny the shadow cast by the theft of the Golden Harvest. Miss Jane Marple sat in her small parlour, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, while Mrs. Bantry, perched on a chintz-covered chair, recounted the latest village gossip with unrestrained enthusiasm. The theft had set tongues wagging, and the name, the Magpie, flitted through every conversation. A spectre woven from newspaper tales and whispered fears. Miss Marple listened, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, as she sifted through the chatter for grains of truth. Dolly, she said, her voice gentle but firm, you've heard these rumours about the Magpie. What exactly are people saying? Her needles paused, and she leaned forward slightly, her attention as sharp as the point of her knitting. Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Oh, Jane, it's all anyone talks about. They say the magpies struck 6 times this year alone. Paintings, jewels, even a silver chalice from a church in Kent. Never leaves a trace, they say, and always targets things no one expects to vanish. Mrs. Price at the post office swears he's a gentleman thief, charming as anything. But Mr. Clements thinks he's a local, someone who blends in." She lowered her voice, as if the walls might overhear. "Some even say it could be someone we know, Jane. Someone in the gallery that night." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "People do love a story, don't they? But a thief like the magpie doesn't work alone, Dolly. He needs eyes and ears, someone to tell him what's worth taking." She thought of a village lad years ago who had tipped off a poacher about the squire's pheasants, all for a share of the spoils. Information, she mused, is as valuable as the prize itself. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, her hat tilting precariously. "You think someone in the gallery was helping him? Mr. Winthrop, perhaps, with all his fussing? Or that nervous boy, Tom Riley?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "I think only that we must look at those closest to the painting. Mr. Winthrop knows the gallery's workings, Miss Crane knows the painting's secrets, and Mr. Hawthorne knows its value. And young Tom," she trailed off, her mind lingering on the cleaner's stammer, his downcast eyes during Inspector Craddock's questioning. "He's a small piece, but even small pieces can shift the pattern." Determined to learn more, Miss Marple suggested a visit to the village post office, a hub of gossip where whispers about the magpie might take shape. Mrs. Bantry, delighted by the prospect of sleuthing, agreed at once, and the two set off, Miss Marple's knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. The post office, a cramped shop with a bell that jingled merrily, was presided over by Mrs. Price, a sharp-eyed woman whose memory for faces rivaled Miss Marple's own. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry!" Mrs. Price greeted them, her hands busy, sorting letters. "I suppose you're here about that dreadful theft. Everyone's talking about the magpie, you know. They say he's struck in 3 counties, always at small galleries or manors where security's not what it seems." She leaned over the counter, her voice dropping. "I saw young Tom Riley in here yesterday, buying stamps for a parcel. Looked nervous as a cat, he did. And he's been spending money lately, more than a cleaner ought to have." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Stamps, you say? For a parcel? That's interesting, Mrs. Price. Did you happen to see where it was addressed?" Mrs. Price shook her head. "Didn't get a good look, but it was a big envelope, the kind you'd use for documents, or something flat. He was in a hurry, kept looking over his shoulder." She paused, then added, "And there's talk about Miss Crane, too." Mr. Clements saw her in the pub, talking to a stranger in a dark coat. "Looked like business," he said, not friendly. Mrs. Bantry's gasp was audible. "A stranger? Jane, do you think it was the magpie himself?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I think, Dolly, that strangers are rarely as strange as they seem. But it's worth noting." She thanked Mrs. Price and led Mrs. Bantry back into the square, her mind turning over the cleaner's parcel and the artist's mysterious meeting. She thought of a village girl who'd once sent stolen lace to a cousin in London, believing a parcel would go unnoticed. "Careless," she murmured, "but telling." That evening, Miss Marple joined Inspector Craddock at the police station, a small building on the edge of the village where he had set up a temporary office. The inspector, his desk strewn with reports, looked up with a weary but welcoming smile. "Miss Marple, you've been out and about, I hear. Any insights from the village grapevine?" She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Only whispers, Inspector, but whispers can be loud if you listen closely. There's talk of the magpie, as you know, and some curious details about young Tom Riley. He's been spending beyond his means, it seems, and sent a parcel recently. And Miss Crane was seen with a stranger, possibly a contact of some kind." Craddock's brow furrowed as he jotted down her words. "Tom Riley, eh? He was jumpy when I questioned him. Claimed he was cleaning the back rooms all evening, but no one saw him after 5:30. And Miss Crane's alibi is shaky at best. As for the magpie—" He tapped a file on his desk. "I've got reports from Scotland Yard. He's hit galleries in Kent, Sussex and Hampshire. Always small venues, always high-value items. Never leaves a fingerprint, but he's known to use insiders. Someone who knows the layout, the security." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "An insider," she repeated. "Someone like a curator, perhaps, or a cleaner with access to every corner. Or even an artist who knows, the painting's worth." She paused, her eyes distant. "The magpie's clever, but he relies on others' weaknesses, greed, desperation, ambition. Those are the threads that bind him to his helpers." Craddock leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You're thinking Tom's our weak link? Or Miss Crane? She's got the skill to fake a painting, if it came to that." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I'm thinking, Inspector, that everyone has a weakness, and the magpie knows how to find it. Tom's nervousness, Miss Crane's debts, Mr. Hawthorne's passion for art, they're all pieces of the same puzzle. But we need more than whispers to see the picture clearly." Craddock nodded, flipping through his file. "We've got the paint smudge from the gallery floor. Ochre, just as you pointed out. The lab says it matches pigments used in the Golden Harvest, but it's fresh, applied within hours of the theft. Could be from the thief's hands or a tool they used. And the alarms," he shook his head, "still no sign of tampering. Whoever did this knew how to bypass them." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or had someone bypass them for them? Young Tom, perhaps, or someone with a key to the system. Mr. Winthrop was so proud of his alarms, wasn't he? Yet pride can blind a man to what's under his nose." She thought of a village gardener who'd boasted of his locked shed, only to miss the key stolen from his own pocket. Craddock closed his file, his gaze steady. "I'll have another word with Tom and check into that parcel. And I'll look into Miss Crane's stranger. If the magpie's involved, we'll need to move fast. He's not one to linger." Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand. "Move fast, Inspector, but look closely. The truth is often in the smallest details. A parcel, a stranger, a smudge of paint. They're like stitches, you see. Pull one, and the whole pattern unravels." As she stepped into the evening air, Mrs. Bantry waiting outside, Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities. The magpie's shadow loomed large, but it was the smaller figures. Tom's stammer, Miss Crane's guarded eyes, Mr. Hawthorne's bluster, that held her attention. She thought of a village boy who'd once helped a smuggler for a handful of coins, believing no one would notice his new boots. "Someone," she murmured, "is wearing new boots now, and they don't fit quite right." Mrs. Bantry linked arms with her, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Jane, you're on to something, aren't you? I can tell by that look in your eye." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I'm only looking, Dolly, at what's there to see, and what's there is always enough if you know where to look." Chapter 7. A Clue in the Canvas. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the meadow gallery. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, its contents a comforting constant amidst the swirl of questions surrounding the Golden Harvest's disappearance. Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for the next piece of the puzzle, had stayed behind to host a morning tea, leaving Miss Marple to accompany Inspector Craddock, who had requested her presence for a closer inspection of the gallery's less public spaces. The inspector's call had been brief but urgent. A discovery in the storage room warranted her sharp eyes. The gallery, stripped of its exhibition day bustle, felt eerily silent, its high ceilings amplifying the soft creak of the oak floor underfoot. Inspector Craddock met Miss Marple at the entrance, his face drawn with the fatigue of a man wrestling with an elusive truth. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone carrying a mix of respect and quiet frustration, "I hope you're ready for a bit of dust. We've found something in the storage room. Nothing conclusive, but it's odd." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Odd things, Inspector, are often the most revealing." Led the way. She followed him through the main hall, past the empty frame of the Golden Harvest, which still hung like a silent accusation. The ochre smudge on the floor, now preserved under a protective cover, seemed to whisper as she passed, though she kept her thoughts to herself. The storage room, tucked behind a discreet door at the gallery's rear, was a cramped space filled with the detritus of past exhibitions. Wooden crates, rolled canvases, and frames stacked haphazardly against the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and varnish, and a single bulb cast stark shadows across the cluttered shelves. A young constable, his uniform slightly askew, stood guard over a corner where a pile of discarded materials had been disturbed. Craddock gestured toward a wooden canvas stretcher, its dimensions roughly matching those of the Golden Harvest lying atop a crate. "Here it is," he said, crouching beside it. "Found it this morning when we did a second sweep. It's the right size for the painting, and there are scratches on the wood, fresh ones by the look of them. Could mean someone removed the canvas carefully, not in a rush." Miss Marple bent forward, her small frame surprisingly agile as she examined the stretcher. The wood was worn but sturdy, its edges marked with faint irregular scratches, as if a tool had been used to pry the canvas free. She ran a gloved finger along the surface, noting a trace of dust disturbed by recent handling. "Careful work," she murmured, her voice soft but precise. Not the sort of thing a panicked thief would manage in a crowded gallery. Whoever did this had time and skill. Craddock nodded, his notebook already open. "That's what I thought. It suggests someone who knew what they were doing. Someone familiar with how paintings are handled. Miss Crane, perhaps, with her restoration work?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Perhaps," she said, her tone noncommittal. "But skill is common enough among those who work with art. The question is opportunity. And intent?" She straightened, her eyes sweeping the room, taking in the jumble of frames and crates. A small overlooked detail caught her attention. A scrap of cloth, caught on a splintered crate, its edge faintly stained with a familiar ochre hue. She pointed it out to Craddock, her voice gentle. "That cloth, Inspector. Might it be worth a closer look?" Craddock retrieved the scrap with a pair of tweezers, holding it to the light. "Looks like canvas," he said, his brow furrowing. "And that stain. It's the same ochre as the smudge on the floor. I'll have the lab compare them." He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've got a knack for this, Miss Marple. I'd have missed that entirely." She smiled faintly, adjusting her shawl. "I only notice what's there, Inspector." A scrap of cloth, a smudge of paint. They're like the dropped stitches in a piece of knitting. They tell you where the pattern went wrong. Her mind drifted to a village carpenter who had once left a splintered board behind after stealing a neighbour's tools. The wood betraying his carelessness. Craddock pocketed the cloth, his expression thoughtful. If this came from the Golden Harvest, it means the canvas was removed here, or nearby. But why leave the stretcher? Why not take the whole thing? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Because a stretcher is bulky, Inspector, and harder to hide. A canvas, rolled carefully, could slip into a bag, a coat, even a portfolio. And if the thief knew the painting's value lay in its surface, the paint, the brushwork, they'd only need the canvas itself." She thought of Miss Crane's studio, the half-finished copy of the Golden Harvest, gleaming with fresh paint, and Mr. Hawthorne's detailed knowledge of the painting's artistry. Someone, she mused, knew exactly what to take. They returned to the main hall, where the gallery's staff lingered under the watchful eyes of Craddock's constables. Tom Riley, the young cleaner, was sweeping the floor near the refreshment table, his movements jerky and his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple watched him, noting the way he avoided the area near the empty frame, as if it held some unspoken threat. She recalled Mrs. Price's tale of his parcel, and the new bicycle he'd been seen riding, a luxury for a lad on a cleaner's wage. "Inspector," she said softly, "have you had any word on Tom Riley's parcel?" Mrs. Price mentioned it at the post office. It might be nothing, but Craddock's eyes sharpened. "I've got a man checking with the post office now. If it's anything unusual, we'll know by tomorrow. Tom's been cagey, but he's young, might just be scared." He paused, glancing at her. "You think he's involved, don't you?" Miss Marple's needles, now retrieved from her bag, clicked softly. "I think young Tom is frightened, Inspector, and frightened people often know more than they say. He's like a boy I knew in the village, who took eggs from the vicar's hens and trembled every time he passed the church. Fear is a heavy burden, and it leaves marks." Craddock nodded, making a note. "I'll press him again. And I'm having Miss Crane's studio searched. Discreetly, of course. That canvas you mentioned, the one that looked like the Golden Harvest, it's been on my mind." Miss Marple's smile was serene, as it should be, Inspector. A painting doesn't vanish without a trace, and a copy doesn't appear without a purpose. Miss Crane's skill, Mr. Hawthorne's passion, Mr. Winthrop's alarms, all pieces of the same puzzle. And young Tom. She trailed off, her eyes lingering on the boy as he swept, his broom missing the same spot repeatedly. "He's a small piece, but even small pieces can shift the whole." As they left the gallery, the mist had lifted, and the village sparkled under a clear sky. Miss Marple's mind was alive with details. The scratched stretcher, the ochre-stained cloth, Tom's nervous glances, and the whispers of the magpie that hung over Saint. Mary Mead like a storm cloud. She thought of a village seamstress who had once hidden stolen fabric in a rolled-up rug, believing no one would unroll it. Someone, she murmured, has unrolled something they shouldn't, and the truth is waiting to be found. Mrs. Bantry, meeting her at the gate, was bursting with questions. "Jane, what did you find? Was it something dreadful? You've got that look again." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she linked arms with her friend. "Only a clue, Dolly, and a small one at that. But clues are like seeds. Plant them, and they grow into something quite revealing. Now, shall we have some tea? I find it helps the mind to settle." Chapter 8. The Village Gossip. The drawing-room of Bantry Hall glowed with the warmth of a crackling fire, its flickering light casting shadows on the floral wallpaper as the scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint perfume of roses from the garden. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, in her element as hostess, presided over a small gathering of Saint. Mary Mead's most talkative residents, her table laden with scones, cucumber sandwiches, and a silver teapot that gleamed with polish. Miss Jane Marple sat near the window, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, her eyes bright and attentive behind her spectacles. The theft of the golden harvest had set the village abuzz, and Mrs. Bantry's tea party was the perfect stage for the gossip that swirled like leaves in an autumn wind. Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks pink with excitement, poured tea with a flourish. "Now, Mrs. Price, you were saying something about young Tom Riley at the post office," she prompted, her voice carrying just enough encouragement to keep the conversation flowing. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the authority of one who held the village's secrets in her sorting trays. "Indeed, Mrs. Bantry. I told Miss Marple just the other day. Tom was in, buying stamps for a parcel, looking as nervous as a hare in a trap. And then, not 2 days later, I saw him riding a shiny new bicycle. Where's a lad like that getting money for such things, I ask you?" She sat back, her lips pursed in satisfaction, as if the bicycle alone were proof of guilt. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly, her mind turning over the detail. She recalled a village boy, years ago, who had flaunted a new pair of boots after helping a poacher, unaware that his sudden wealth had drawn every eye. "A bicycle," she murmured, her voice soft but clear. "That's quite an expense for a cleaner." "Did he say anything about it, Mrs. Price?" Mrs. Price shook her head, her earrings jangling. "Not a word, Miss Marple, but he was in a rush, kept glancing out the window as if expecting someone. And that parcel, it was flat, like a big envelope, but heavy. I couldn't help wondering if it had something to do with that painting." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, drawing nods from the other guests. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, chimed in, her voice gentle but tinged with disapproval. "I don't like to think ill of the boy, but he's been odd lately. My husband saw him walking late at night, near the gallery, long after his shift. What business has a cleaner got, wandering about at such hours?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "Young people often keep late hours, Mrs. Clement, but it's curious, isn't it, that he chose the gallery's vicinity. She thought of a maid in Saint, Mary Mead, who had lingered near the manor house after dark, carrying love letters for a footman and secrets for someone else entirely. Habits, she mused, betray more than intentions. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, clapped her hands. And what about Miss Crane? Mr. Clement saw her at the pub with that stranger, didn't he? Jane, you think it's the magpie, don't you? Her voice was loud enough to make the teacups rattle, and the other ladies leaned closer, their curiosity palpable. Mrs. Clement nodded, her hands smoothing her skirt. My husband did mention it. He said Miss Crane was at the Blue Boar, in a corner booth, talking to a man in a dark coat. They were hushed, he said, like they didn't want to be overheard. And she looked, well, not herself. Anxious, perhaps Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving the threads of gossip into a pattern. A stranger at the Blue Boar, she said softly, and Miss Crane, anxious. That's worth noting. Did Mr. Clements describe this man, Mrs. Clement? Mrs. Clement frowned, trying to recall. Not much, I'm afraid. Dark coat, hat pulled low. Ordinary, really, but not from the village. Mr. Clements thought he might be a dealer. The way he carried himself, all businesslike. But Miss Crane left quickly when she saw my husband watching. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Miss Crane's studio, the fresh paint on her canvas and the guarded look in her eyes. She recalled a village artist who had once sold a forged sketch to a passing dealer, believing the transaction would stay secret. Anxious people, she thought, often have something to hide, even if it's only fear. The conversation turned to Mr. Hawthorne, whose loud presence at the Red Lion had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Price lowered her voice, as if the collector might overhear from across the village. He's been throwing money about, you know. Bought drinks for half the pub last night, boasting about his art collection. Said he'd have had the golden harvest if not for some sneak thief. But I heard from Mrs. Ellis that he was asking Mr. Winthrop odd questions before the exhibition, about the painting's frame of all things. Miss Marple's needles paused again, her eyes narrowing slightly. The frame, she repeated, her voice almost a whisper. That's an unusual detail to notice, Mrs. Price. Did Mrs. Ellis say more? Mrs. Price shook her head. Only that he was curious about how it was secured, whether it was wired to the alarm. She thought it strange, but then he's a collector, always fussing over details. She sipped her tea, her expression smug. If you ask me, he's too loud to be honest. Mrs. Bantry laughed, nearly spilling her tea. Oh, Mrs. Price, you're as bad as Jane, always seeing secrets everywhere. But what do you think, Jane? Is Mr. Hawthorne our thief, or just a blowhard? Miss Marple's smile was faint, her eyes distant as she considered the new information. I think, Dolly, that Mr. Hawthorne's curiosity about the frame is illuminating. A painting is one thing, but a frame, its mechanics, its alarms, that's a different sort of interest. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead jeweller, who had once asked too many questions about a safe's lock, only to be caught tampering with it later. Details, she murmured, are the threads that unravel a lie. The tea party continued, the ladies trading theories about the magpie, Tom Riley's bicycle, and Miss Crane's stranger. Miss Marple listened, her knitting a steady counterpoint to their chatter, her mind sorting through the fragments. she noted the absence of Mr. Winthrop in the gossip, his fastidious nature shielding him from suspicion, yet his nervous cufflinks lingered in her memory. Everyone, she thought, has a part in this tapestry, but some threads are knotted more tightly than others. As the guests departed, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes sparkling. "Jane, you're positively glowing. You've found something in all this talk, haven't you?" Miss Marple folded her knitting, her smile serene. "Only whispers, Dolly, but whispers have a way of growing louder. Tom's bicycle, Miss Crane's stranger, Mr. Hawthorne's questions about the frame, they're all stitches in the pattern. And patterns, you know, always lead somewhere," she rose, her knitting bag in hand, her mind already turning to the next step. "I think a word with Inspector Craddock might be in order. Gossip is a fine start, but facts will tie the knot." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, delighted. "Oh, Jane, you're impossible. I swear you see more in a teacup than I do in a whole room. Shall I come with you to the police station?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not this time, Dolly. Let's leave the inspector to his work, and I'll see what else the village has to say. After all, the truth is like a good piece of knitting. It takes time, but every stitch counts." As she stepped into the afternoon light, the village seemed to hum with secrets, each whisper a thread waiting to be pulled. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the frame, the bicycle, and the stranger in the dark coat, each a clue to the puzzle of the golden harvest. She thought of a village gossip who had once revealed a theft by mentioning a single misplaced hairpin. "Small things," she murmured, "always tell the biggest stories." Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, the first hint of autumn brushing against the village's tidy gardens and quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in the small, orderly office of Inspector Craddock at the police station, her knitting bag resting on the floor beside her, its contents untouched as she leaned forward, her eyes bright with purpose. The room, lit by a single desk lamp, smelled faintly of ink and polished wood, and Craddock's desk was strewn with reports, maps, and a photograph of the ochre-stained cloth found in the gallery's storage room. Mrs. Bantry had been left at home, her enthusiasm for sleuthing tempered by a promise to host another tea party for further gossip, leaving Miss Marple to share her latest thoughts with the inspector. "Inspector," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm, "I've been thinking about our thief, whether it's the magpie or someone closer to home. A painting like the Golden Harvest doesn't vanish without a plan, and plans leave traces. The smudge, the stretcher, young Tom's bicycle, they're all threads, but we need to pull them together. Have you considered a trap?" Craddock leaned back, his lean face showing a mix of curiosity and respect. "A trap, Miss Marple? You've got my attention. What did you have in mind?" He set his pen down, his notebook open to a fresh page, ready to capture her words. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thieves, Inspector, are drawn to opportunity, especially one as bold as the magpie. If we let it be known that another rare painting, something similar to the Golden Harvest, is to be displayed at a nearby auction, our thief might be tempted to act again. A careful watch, a few discreet officers, and we might catch them in the act, or at least see who takes an interest." Craddock's eyes narrowed, his mind already turning over the logistics. "It's risky, but it could work. We'd need a convincing bait, a painting with enough allure to draw attention, but not so valuable as to endanger it. And we'd need to spread the word subtly so it doesn't look like a setup. He tapped his pen against the desk, considering. There's an auction house in Chipping Cleghorn, not far from here. They're hosting a sale next week. I could arrange for a painting to be added to the catalogue. Something from the county's reserve collection, perhaps. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she retrieved them from her bag. Exactly, Inspector. And let the village talk. Mrs. Price at the post office, Mrs. Clement at the vicarage. They'll spread the word faster than any newspaper. If our thief is local, or has a local accomplice, they'll hear of it. She thought of a village poacher who had once been lured by a rumour of unguarded pheasants, only to find the gamekeeper waiting. Greed, she mused, is a powerful lure. Craddock made a note, his expression resolute. I'll set it up. We'll call it a rediscovered Dutch landscape, similar period to the Golden Harvest. I'll have my men pose as auction staff and bidders, keep an eye on anyone who shows too much interest. But who do you think we're watching for? Tom Riley? Miss Crane? Or Hawthorne? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. All of them, Inspector, and perhaps someone we haven't yet considered. Tom's nervousness, Miss Crane's canvas, Mr. Hawthorne's questions about the frame, they all point to knowledge, but not yet to guilt. A trap will show us who moves and how she paused, her needles pausing too. And don't forget the stranger at the Blue Boar. If the magpie is involved, he'll need a local hand to guide him. Craddock nodded, his respect for her insight deepening. I've got a lead on that stranger. My men traced a man in a dark coat to a boarding house in Chipping Cleghorn. No name yet, but he paid in cash and kept to himself. Could be nothing, but I'll have him watched. He glanced at her, a faint smile breaking through. You're a step ahead, as always, Miss Marple. She smiled serenely, adjusting her shawl. I only see what's there, Inspector. People are so predictable in their unpredictability. A thief, especially one as clever as the magpie, will sniff out opportunity. But they'll also betray themselves with a glance, a step, a moment's hesitation. The plan was set in motion the next day. Craddock arranged for a modest announcement in the local paper. Tucked among the advertisements, a newly discovered Dutch painting, The Amber Fields, would be featured at the Chipping Cleghorn auction. Its provenance tantalizingly vague, but its value hinted at in glowing terms. Mrs. Bantry, true to form, shared the news at her tea party, ensuring it reached the ears of Mrs. Price, Mrs. Clement, and half the village by sundown. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her usual walk through the square, her eyes noting the reactions of those she passed. Tom Riley, pedalling his new bicycle with a wary glance. Miss Crane sketching in her garden, her pencil pausing as a neighbour mentioned the auction. Mr. Hawthorne, holding court at the Red Lion, his voice louder than ever as he scoffed at the new painting's worth. The auction day arrived, a brisk morning with a sky as clear as glass. The Chipping Cleghorn auction house, a converted barn with high rafters and a polished floor, buzzed with anticipation. The bait, a modest but finely crafted Dutch landscape, borrowed from a museum's reserve, was displayed prominently, its golden hues echoing the Golden Harvest's allure. Craddock's men, disguised as bidders and staff, mingled with the crowd, their eyes sharp for any sign of suspicion. Miss Marple, dressed in her best tweed and a discreet hat, sat in the back row, her knitting bag at her feet, her gaze sweeping the room like a quiet tide. Mr. Hawthorne was the first to catch her eye, striding in with his usual bluster, his crimson waistcoat a beacon among the muted tones of the other bidders. He examined the amber fields with exaggerated care, his loud comments on its brushwork drawing attention. "Not a patch on the golden harvest," he declared, but his fingers lingered on the frame, testing its edges with a familiarity that made Miss Marple's needles pause. "He's curious," she thought, "but is it greed or habit?" Miss Crane was absent, a detail Miss Marple noted with interest. "An artist who misses an auction of a Dutch painting," she murmured, "is either uninterested or avoiding attention." She recalled a village painter who had skipped a fair after selling a forged sketch, fearing scrutiny. But her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar figure. Tom Riley, lingering near the auction house entrance, his cap pulled low. He carried a small parcel, not unlike the one Mrs. Price had described, and his eyes darted nervously as he slipped a note to a man in a dark coat, a man whose hat obscured his face. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She nudged Craddock, who sat beside her in plain clothes, and whispered, "That boy, Inspector Tom! He's passing something to that man. It may be nothing, but—" Craddock's eyes followed her gaze, and he signalled to a constable nearby. "Keep an eye on that man in the coat," he murmured. "Don't let him leave." He turned back to Miss Marple, his voice low. "You think Tom's our link to the magpie?" "I think," she replied softly, "that Tom is frightened, and frightened boys do foolish things for money. That note, that man, they're threads, Inspector. Pull them gently, and we'll see what unravels." The auction proceeded, the room filling with the rhythmic cadence of the auctioneer's voice. The amber fields drew bids, but none too eager, as Craddock's men watched the crowd. Mr. Hawthorne bid loudly, his offers more performative than serious, while Tom lingered at the edges, his parcel clutched tightly. The man in the dark coat slipped out, followed discreetly by a constable, and Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving the scene into her growing tapestry of clues. As the auction ended, Craddock leaned toward her. "We've got the man in the coat in custody." He's not talking yet, but he had Tom's note, a sketch of the auction house layout, with the painting's location marked. Tom's being brought in now. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. "A sketch," she murmured. "How like an artist to draw a map. But whose hand drew it, I wonder?" She thought of Miss Crane's studio, the fresh paint on her canvas, and Tom's nervous fingers. "Someone," she said softly, "is pulling strings, and Tom is only the puppet." Mrs. Bantry, meeting her later at Bantry Hall, was beside herself. "Jane, you set a trap. Did you catch the magpie? Was it Tom all along?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Not quite, Dolly. We've caught a thread, but the tapestry is still unfinished. Tom's note, the man in the coat, they're pieces, but the picture needs more. And I think," she added, her eyes twinkling, "we'll find it soon if we keep watching." Chapter 10. The Black Market Connection. The evening shadows stretched long across St. Mary Mead cloaking the village in a quiet that seemed to hold its breath. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour, the fire casting a warm glow on her knitting, which lay momentarily idle in her lap. Her eyes, bright and unyielding behind her spectacles, were fixed on the flickering flames as she turned over the events of the auction in Chipping Cleghorn. The trap had been sprung, and though it had not yet caught the thief, it had snared a vital thread, one that led beyond the village to a world of shadows and secrets. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist the lure of news, had joined her, her face alight with anticipation, as she waited for Miss Marple to share the latest from Inspector Craddock. "Jane, you must tell me everything," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, settling into a chintz armchair with a cup of tea. "Did they catch the magpie? Was it that man in the dark coat? And what about Tom Riley's note? I swear, I haven't slept a wink thinking about it." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her hands resuming their knitting with a soft click of needles. "Patience, Dolly. The inspector has made progress, but the puzzle is not yet complete. The man in the coat is a piece, but not the whole picture." She paused, her eyes distant. "It's like a piece of knitting. One dropped stitch can unravel the lot, but only if you know where to pull." Earlier that day, Inspector Craddock had called Miss Marple to the police station, his voice taut with restrained excitement. The man in the dark coat, apprehended after receiving Tom Riley's note at the auction, had been identified as Arthur Finch, a known associate of black market dealers with a history of fencing stolen art. Craddock had met her in his small office, where a map of the region was pinned to the wall, red lines marking Finch's movements from Chipping Cleghorn to a warehouse on the outskirts of London. "Finch isn't the magpie," Craddock had explained, his notebook open before him. "But he's close to the operation. He's admitted to being a courier, moving stolen goods for a network that deals in high-value antiques. We followed him to a warehouse in Bermondsey last night. Small place, nondescript, perfect for hiding things." His eyes had gleamed with the thrill of the chase. "We raided it at dawn, found the golden harvest, wrapped in oilcloth, ready for transport. It's being authenticated now, but it looks genuine." Miss Marple had nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. "And Finch's confession, Inspector? Did he say who hired him?" Craddock's face had tightened. "He's cagey, claims he never met the boss, only took orders through notes and dead drops. But he confirmed the painting came from St. Mary Mead, delivered by someone who knew its exact value and the gallery's layout. Someone local, he said, though he swears he doesn't know the name." Miss Marple had leaned forward, her voice soft. "And young Tom's note? The sketch of the auction house?" Craddock had produced a folded paper, its edges creased from handling. The sketch was crude but precise, detailing the auction house's entrances and the placement of the amber fields. "Finch says he got it from Tom, but Tom claims he was only passing it on, told to do so by someone he won't name. He's scared, Miss Marple, scared stiff." She had studied the sketch, noting the careful lines, the artist's touch in the shading. "Not Tom's hand," she had murmured. "He's no draftsman. Someone gave him this, someone with skill." Her thoughts had drifted to Miss Crane's studio, the half-finished canvas glowing with fresh ochre paint, and the guarded look in her eyes. Now in her parlour, Miss Marple shared the essentials with Mrs. Bantry, her voice measured. "The painting's been found, Dolly, in a warehouse in London. A man named Finch, a courier for the black market, was caught with Tom's note, a sketch of the auction house. It seems our thief, or their accomplice, planned to strike again." Mrs. Bantry's teacup clattered in its saucer. "Found? Oh, Jane, that's marvellous. But who gave it to Finch? Tom? Or do you think it's Miss Crane? She's the artist, after all. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Miss Crane has the skill, certainly, and her canvas was suspiciously fresh. But Tom's fear, his new bicycle, the parcel he sent, they point to a boy caught in someone else's net. She thought of a village lad who had once carried stolen goods for a smuggler, trembling with guilt, but bound by promises of coin. Tom is a link, Dolly, but not the mastermind. Someone used him, someone who knew the painting's worth and the gallery's weaknesses. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. Mr. Winthrop, then? He's so fussy about his alarms, but they didn't go off. Or Mr. Hawthorne, with all his talk about frames and Amsterdam contacts. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Both have their secrets, Dolly. Mr. Winthrop's pride in his security may hide a lapse, and Mr. Hawthorne's knowledge is too precise for a mere buyer. But the sketch, the ochre smudge, the canvas stretcher, they point to someone who could handle a painting with care, someone who could slip it from its frame without a sound. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Miss Crane's studio holds answers, I think, but Tom's fear may unlock them. The next morning, Miss Marple accompanied Craddock to question Tom Riley at the police station. The boy sat in a small room, his freckled face pale and his hands twisting in his lap. His new bicycle, confiscated for evidence, stood in a corner, its chrome gleaming incongruously against the drab walls. Craddock's tone was firm, but not harsh, his experience with nervous youths guiding his approach. "Tom," he began, "you've admitted to passing the note to Finch, but you're protecting someone. Tell us who, and it'll go easier for you. You're in deep. Helping a thief like the Magpie isn't a small matter." Tom's eyes darted to Miss Marple, who sat quietly, her knitting untouched. Her presence, calm and unassuming, seemed to unnerve him more than Craddock's questions. I didn't know it was the Magpie," he stammered. "I was just told to pass the note, that's all. They said it was a job, a bit of money for me. I needed it, my mum's sick, and the bills." His voice broke, and he looked down, his fingers gripping his knees. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost maternal. "Tom, dear, you're frightened, and that's natural. But keeping silent only tightens the knot. Who gave you the note? Was it Miss Crane?" Her eyes, soft but piercing, held his, and she saw the flicker of panic she'd expected. Tom's shoulders slumped, his voice barely a whisper. "It was her, Miss Crane. She gave me the sketch, told me to give it to the man at the auction, said it was about a painting, nothing more. She paid me for it, and for other things." He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the floor. Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. "Other things, Tom." "Like what?" "Disabling the gallery's alarms." Tom nodded, his face crumpling. "Just for a few minutes, the night of the exhibition. She said it was to check something, that it wouldn't hurt anyone. I didn't know she'd take the painting. I swear, I thought it was just a favour." Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly. "A favour," she repeated, her tone kind but probing. "And the parcel you sent, Tom? Was that Miss Crane's doing too?" Tom's eyes widened, his stammer returning. Yes. She gave me a package, said it was papers, nothing important. I sent it to an address in London, like she told me." He hesitated, then added, "But it was heavy, like it could have been a rolled-up canvas." Craddock's pen moved swiftly, recording every word. "We'll trace that parcel, Tom. If it's the painting, you've helped us more than you know. but you need to tell us everything. Any other names? Any other jobs?" Tom shook his head, his voice small. "Just Miss Crane. She said I'd get more money if I kept quiet. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Miss Marple's smile was compassionate, but her mind was sharp. She thought of a village girl who had carried messages for a smuggler, believing them harmless until the truth unravelled. "Fear and money," she murmured, "are powerful persuaders, but they leave traces." She turned to Craddock, her voice low. "Inspector, Miss Crane's studio deserves another look. If she's working with the Magpie, or for herself, there'll be evidence, paint, tools, perhaps another sketch." Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "I've got a warrant ready. We'll search her place this afternoon. And Finch, he's still not talking, but we're leaning on him. If he's linked to Miss Crane, we'll find it." As Miss Marple left the station, the village seemed to hum with hidden currents. The Black Market connection, a dark thread weaving through its quiet lanes. She thought of the ochre smudge, the scratched stretcher, and Tom's trembling confession. "Someone," she murmured, "has woven a clever web, but webs are fragile when you find the right strand." Mrs. Bantry, waiting at the gate, pounced on her. "Jane, is it true? The painting's found? And Tom, did he confess?" Miss Marple linked arms with her friend, her smile serene. "A step closer, Dolly, but not the end. The painting's safe, but the thief's hand is still hidden. Miss Crane's canvas, Tom's fear, their stitches, but the pattern's not yet clear. We'll need one more pull to see it all." Chapter 11. The Confession. The late afternoon light filtered through the narrow windows of the St. Mary Mead police station, casting long, slanting shadows across the bare floor of the interrogation room. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting bag at her feet, her hands folded serenely in her lap, as she observed the scene with her usual, unobtrusive keenness. Inspector Craddock stood by a small table, his lean frame taut with purpose as he faced Tom Riley, whose freckled face was pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness and fear. The air was heavy with the weight of impending truth, and the faint hum of the village outside seemed a world away from the stark reality within. Mrs. Bantry had been persuaded to remain at Bantry Hall, her eagerness to witness the interrogation tempered by Miss Marple's gentle insistence that the boy needed space to speak freely. "Dolly," she had said, "sometimes a crowd makes a frightened soul clam up, and young Tom is frightened enough already." Now, as Craddock began his questioning, Miss Marple's presence was a quiet anchor, her eyes missing nothing. "Tom," Craddock said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you've told us Miss Crane gave you the sketch and asked you to disable the gallery's alarms. You've admitted to sending a parcel for her. Now's the time to tell us everything, every detail, every name. You're in deep, lad, but honesty will help you more than silence." Tom's hands twisted in his lap, his knuckles white. He glanced at Miss Marple, her calm gaze seeming to steady him, though it also stirred a flicker of shame. I didn't mean for it to go this far, sir," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Crane, she came to me a month ago, said she needed help with something at the gallery. Said it was just a small job, nothing wrong. She knew my mum's been poorly, and the bills—" He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple's expression softened, Though her mind was as sharp as ever, she thought of a village boy who had once taken a shilling to carry a smuggler's parcel, his innocence twisted by need. Poverty, she mused, is a cruel lever for those who know how to pull it. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. "Tom, dear, what did Miss Crane ask you to do exactly? Tell us, and it will be easier for you." Tom's shoulders slumped, and the words spilled out like water from a broken dam. She said she needed to check the painting, the Golden Harvest, for her restoration records. Said the alarms would get in the way. So I was to turn them off, just for a few minutes, at 6 o'clock. I know the system, sir. Mr. Winthrop showed me how it works, in case I ever needed to clean around it. It's just a switch in the back room, easy to flick off and on. He paused, his voice trembling. I did it, like she said, and left through the back door. I didn't see her take anything, I swear. Craddock's pen moved swiftly across his notebook, capturing every word. And the parcel, Tom? The one you sent to London? Tom's eyes widened, his stammer returning. She gave it to me the next day, said it was papers. Research for her work. It was flat, heavy, wrapped in brown paper. I sent it to an address she gave me. Some place in London, near the docks. She paid me £10, sir, and promised more if I kept quiet. His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. I didn't know it was the painting, I thought. I thought it was just papers. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind turning over the details, the parcel, the fresh paint in Miss Crane's studio, the ochre smudge on the gallery floor. All pointed to a plan far more intricate than a simple theft. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead seamstress, who had smuggled stolen lace in a parcel of patterns, believing her employer's word that it was harmless. Trust, she thought, is a thief's greatest tool. Craddock leaned forward, his tone steady. Tom, you said Miss Crane promised more money. Did she mention anyone else? A man in a dark coat, perhaps? Or the magpie? Tom shook his head, his voice muffled. No, sir. Just her. She said it was her project, that she'd make sure I was taken care of. But I saw her with the man at the Blue Boar, like Mrs. Clement said. I didn't hear what they talked about, but she looked scared, like she was in over her head. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her expression remained kind. Scared, Tom? That's interesting. Did she ever mention why she needed the painting, or what she planned to do with it? Tom hesitated, his fingers twisting a loose thread on his sleeve. Once, sir, she said something about the black market, how some paintings fetch more there than in any auction. I thought she was just talking, you know, like artists do. But then she gave me the parcel, and I started to wonder. His voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't want to know, Miss Marple. I just wanted the money for Mum Craddock, exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, his expression grim. We've traced the parcel, Tom. It went to a warehouse in Bermondsey, where we found the Golden Harvest. Your information matches what Finch told us. He was to pick it up for a buyer, someone paying a fortune. You've helped us, but you're not out of the woods yet. If you know anything more, now's the time. Tom shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. That's all, sir. I swear it. I didn't know it was stealing, not till it was too late. Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost maternal. You've done right to tell us, Tom. Fear makes fools of us all, but truth sets things straight. She turned to Craddock. her tone low. "Inspector, I think a visit to Miss Crane is in order. If she's behind this, her studio will tell us more than she will." Craddock nodded, closing his notebook with a snap. "We're searching her cottage now." Finch mentioned a contact in London, someone who knew the painting's exact specifications, size, pigments, even the frame's weight. Sounds like an artist's knowledge to me. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "You suspected her from the start, didn't you?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I suspected only that someone knew too much, Inspector. Miss Crane's canvas, her meeting with the stranger, Tom's parcel, their stitches in a pattern, and she's at the centre. But whether she's the magpie or merely his tool, we'll soon see." She thought of a village painter who had once forged a portrait for a quick profit, her skill undone by a single misplaced brushstroke. Cleverness, she mused, is a fragile shield. The search of Miss Crane's studio, conducted that afternoon, yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Craddock's men found a set of pigments matching the ochre smudge from the gallery floor, a roll of canvas cut to the exact dimensions of the Golden Harvest, and a notebook with sketches of the gallery's layout, including the alarm system switch. Most damning was a half-finished letter, tucked beneath a pallet, addressed to an unnamed contact in London, hinting at a substitute painting to be delivered after the original was sold. Craddock shared the findings with Miss Marple. As they stood outside the station, the village settling into dusk. "It's enough to bring her in," he said, his voice grim. "She used Tom to disable the alarms, swapped the painting for a copy she'd made, and sent the original to Finch for the black market. Hawthorne was a distraction. His bluster kept everyone looking at him while she worked." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. "A clever plan, Inspector, but not without flaws. The smudge, the stretcher, Tom's fear, they were her dropped stitches. And Mr. Hawthorne? His knowledge of the frame suggests he may have been more than a bystander." She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Merchant, who had played the fool to mask his role in a theft. "People," she murmured, "hide in plain sight." Mrs. Bantry, meeting her later at Bantry Hall, was agog. "Jane, it's Miss Crane. I knew it. But is she the magpie?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Not the magpie, Dolly, but his accomplice, I think. Her skill made the theft possible, but someone else pulled the strings. We've one more knot to untie, and then the pattern will be clear." Chapter 12. The Final Piece. The Meadow Gallery stood bathed in the soft glow of a September morning, its tall windows catching the first rays of sunlight, as if to reclaim its dignity after the scandal of the theft. Inside, the empty frame of the Golden Harvest had been restored to its former glory, the painting itself carefully rehung under the watchful eyes of Inspector Craddock and his team. The canvas, recovered from the Bermondsey warehouse, gleamed with its luminous wheat fields and radiant sky, a testament to the Dutch master's skill and to the tenacity of those who had unravelled its disappearance. Miss Jane Marple stood before it, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Bantry, ever her enthusiastic companion, hovered nearby, her face alight with the thrill of resolution. "Jane, it's back where it belongs," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her voice echoing in the nearly empty gallery. "And to think you and the inspector caught the culprits. I can hardly believe it was Miss Crane all along. Tell me everything. How did you know?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her hands resting lightly on her bag. "I didn't know, Dolly, not at first. But people leave traces, like threads in a piece of knitting, and Miss Crane's were too bright to ignore." She gestured toward the painting, her voice soft but clear. "Shall we sit and I'll explain? It's a simple story, really, when you see the pattern." They settled on a cushioned bench, the gallery's oak floor gleaming under the morning light. Inspector Craddock joined them, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of weary triumph. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone warm with respect, "you've earned a rest after this one. But I'd like to hear your take, how you pieced it together." I'll admit, I was ready to suspect Hawthorne or even Winthrop at one point. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she began, her voice calm and precise. "It was the small things, Inspector, as it always is. The ochre smudge on the gallery floor, the scratched canvas stretcher, Tom Riley's new bicycle, they were all stitches, pointing to someone with skill, access, and a motive. Miss Crane, with her restoration work, knew the Golden Harvest better than anyone. She could replicate its every stroke, its every hue. And her studio, with that fresh-painted canvas, told me she'd been working on something more than a study." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "The copy! You saw it in her studio, didn't you? She was going to swap it for the real one." Miss Marple nodded, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Exactly, Dolly. Miss Crane's plan was clever. She created a near-perfect copy of the Golden Harvest, intending to replace the original during the exhibition. Tom Riley, poor lad, was her tool. His need for money, with his mother's illness, made him vulnerable. She paid him to disable the alarms for a few minutes, just long enough for her to remove the original canvas and leave the copy in its place. The smudge, the stretcher, these were her mistakes, left in the haste of execution." Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And the parcel Tom sent to London, that was the original painting, wrapped and ready for the black market. Finch, our courier, confirmed it was delivered to the warehouse for a buyer he never met. But how did you know it wasn't the magpie himself?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "The magpie is a shadow, Inspector, working through others." Miss Crane's letter, found in her studio, hinted at a substitute painting, and her meeting with the stranger at the Blue Boar suggested a connection to someone with black market ties. But her fear, as Tom described it, told me she was not the mastermind, only a skilled hand, hired for her artistry. The magpie, or someone like him, provided the buyer and the plan. Miss Crane provided the copy, and the theft Mrs. Bantry's gasp was audible. So she fooled everyone, even Mr. Hawthorne. He was going to buy her fake, wasn't he? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Mr. Hawthorne was a convenient distraction, Dolly. His loud bids, his questions about the frame, they drew every eye, making it easier for Miss Crane to work unnoticed. But I suspect he knew more than he let on. His knowledge of the painting's details, his Amsterdam contacts, they suggest he may have been approached by the same network, though we've no proof he acted on it. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Merchant, who had played the fool to mask his dealings with a smuggler. People, she murmured, often hide behind their own noise. Craddock leaned back, his arms crossed. We've got Miss Crane in custody, and she's confessed to the theft and the forgery. She claims she was approached by a man, likely Finch's contact, who offered her a cut of the profits. Tom's testimony backs her up, and we're working on tracing the buyer. As for Hawthorne, he's clear for now, but I'll keep an eye on him. Winthrop's shaken, but his alarms were indeed bypassed, just as Tom said. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze returning to the painting. Poor Mr. Winthrop. His pride in his security was his blind spot. And Tom, caught by need, will learn from this, I hope. She thought of a village girl who had once forged a letter for a few coins, her regret outweighing her gain. Greed and fear, she said softly, make such fragile threads. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, her hat nearly tumbling off. Jane, you're a marvel. You saw it all. The smudge, the canvas, Tom's bicycle. I'd have missed every bit of it. Miss Marple's smile was serene. I only saw what was there, Dolly. A painting doesn't vanish without a trace, and people don't hide without leaving a shadow. The trick is to look closely and listen. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, her eyes lingering on the golden harvest. It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? Worth all the trouble, in its way. As they left the gallery, mister, Hawthorne arrived, his crimson waistcoat as loud as ever. He had secured the painting in the end, his offer accepted by a relieved Mr. Winthrop. He nodded to Miss Marple, his bluster subdued, and she returned the gesture, her eyes sharp but kind. He'll never know, she thought, how close he came to owning a fake. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The village was quiet again, the scandal fading into whispers, but her mind lingered on the pattern she had unravelled. People, she murmured, are so predictable, yet so surprising. And the truth, like good wool, always holds its shape when you pull it taut.